For this next session of the Future of the American Child journalism training, I bet all of you thought you knew what the word nerds means. I am personally a proud card-carrying member of the Nerd Society because I come from a large family of, bookish people, and we were all called nerds. But in planning for this training, I found a new definition. It's called, NERD stands for the National Education Resource Database on Schools. And it describes itself as the first ever national data set of public K through 12 spending by school. Which, when I read this, it came up on my phone as a New York Times alert, and I thought, that's incredible. That someone took the time to do that, but more importantly, what a resource that would be for journalists all around the country who care about education or who cover education. So we are joined this morning by my new best friend, who we have Zanzibar in common and Kenya and whatever, Ash Dhammani. He is a policy and data analyst at the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University, their Seattle branch, where he leads the school-level expenditure data collection, standardization, and publication efforts. And his research focuses on fiscal data transparency through database development and custom and practical visualizations, which I can tell you, I've seen his presentation and it's gonna knock your socks off. But more importantly, I think what we have here is a resource that moving forward is going to help us, whether we cover education or whether we're interested in it. It's going to be very, very important to us. So please welcome Ash Dhammani.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was very kind and warm, and I really appreciate the welcome, and I'm very excited to be here. Like she said, I am Ash Dhammani. I am from Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University. My current role there is a policy and data analyst. It's just a fancy term for saying a researcher. We're an education finance shop, so that basically means we do research about public education funding, spending, and everything in between. But what I'm really, really excited to do today with you all is join in this conversation talking about the future of the American child. What an apt prompt. We're living in the most unprecedented times where we have to talk about utilizing data to make decisions so we can get our kids back on track. As I'm sure the speakers before me have alluded to, I cannot stress enough the importance of education and the role that it plays in the future success of a child and the communities that they live in. Time and time again, research has proven that the future and success of a community is related to a child and their upbringing. So education being a key part of that, it impacts us, the people who live in this community and write stories about the community. So I'm here to help you sort of walk through that. And also, I want to use data to help you write some meaningful stories and spark conversations that will drive and propel this movement forward. So to get you started, I can't lie, I love data. I love everything about data. Data is my favorite, and maybe Will Ferrell sometimes too. But I want to help you sort of get started with the tools that are necessary to answer some key questions that we're faced with in these times, and especially in the face of the world that we're living in. So my goal with this presentation is threefold. First, I want to give you some tools, like I've said several times now, that we at Edunomics Lab have built to help answer some questions, not only questions about education finance, but also how to take education finance a step further and make it compatible with outcomes, performance outcomes, results, especially for the investment we're making in our kids. So that's my first goal today. Second, I will fold in some story ideas. I mean, you guys are journalists. That's probably what you're here for. So I want to help you sort of build some building blocks. It will not be the whole enchilada. I'm not giving you an entire article, but I'll help you build those blocks and answer some questions. So this presentation will be in the form of some questions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well, that will help us get to a point where we'll come up with some story ideas ourselves. And lastly, I will also try my best, and I mean it, I will try my very best to give you a little bit of a school finance 101, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that's out there. And it may not necessarily be for a misunderstanding within you, but your readers. So I want to make sure that I sort of take you on this journey and help you understand how school finance works. The packets that you see in front of you, they're not necessarily articles that are referenced in this presentation, but they're great background reading. And if you want to get a better deep dive into education finance as a whole and some things that I touch upon today, those articles are a great start. You will also notice nerd stickers in your packets, so please sport them with pride. After today, you will be one of us officially as the chief architect of nerds. I think I have the authority to say that. So I'm really excited to be a part of this journey, and I hope that you'll take some wisdom away today, and a little bit of learning that might help you write better stories in education finance specifically. So like I said, I'm a researcher. And I did a little bit of research. I understand that not everyone here may have written a story about education finance in the past or education at large. So I want to get your buy-in, and this is my hook. So pandemic learning loss could reduce the lifetime earnings of a student by $70,000. Without action, not only will individuals in the COVID cohort of students suffer long-term income losses, but also the individual states will see shrunken economic activity. That is so powerful. And it's a quote from a recent research study published by my personal idol in the industry, Dr. Erika, who's a Stanford economist. And his research has been highly regarded in the industry. And it's very critical. It's so important for us to understand in these unprecedented times where when the NAEP scores came out, everybody was just so shell-shocked that our kids were so far behind, and that is true. And it may not necessarily be a new story to a lot of researchers because they were already struggling, but I think the pandemic just really aggravated it and stepped a little bit much forward where we have to kind of go back in time and figure out, okay, well, how do we make up for this learning loss? So now is the time that we help raise awareness and especially bring in the money aspect of things. How do we use smart, practical investments, especially read those about in our stories, how do we use practical, smart investments to help make up for this learning loss? So we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation as well. So I hope this will sort of propel us in a direction where we'll be able to write stories that put data into the context and also build your repertoire of education finance at large. All right, I'm gonna let you dive head in. With whatever knowledge you have of education finance from your past, if you've heard of the term before, which district do you think is in the bottom 1% of all US districts in terms of per pupil funding? All of these districts have more than 5,000 students, and I want to hear from you which ones do you think fall in the bottom 1% in terms of the amount of money they spend per kid, so per pupil funding. Feel free to shout out answers. Utah, Idaho, Mississippi. Wait, yeah, there is Mississippi. Okay, you guys were right. Utah is one of them. They spend about $6,646 per student. Pocatello, Idaho, another correct answer, $6,925. Now, before we get too confused why the word per pupil funding is a denominator that is extremely easily digestible and approachable. When you tell a parent, ma'am, we're spending $6,000 for your child for their education, it goes a very, very long way instead of putting in front of them a very long list or laundry list of district budgets that give you numbers in millions, sometimes billions of dollars, and they're very hard to digest. We did a research study with 27 LEA local education agencies that helped us prove that per pupil expenditure was digestible by every single stakeholder that is involved in the world of education, parents, teachers, district leaders, state leaders, and the federal government involved. And I will come back to the point of federal government involved in just a second. So when you write your stories, I would love for you to keep in mind that the per pupil spending will really go a long way. It will get your readers involved and help them sort of relate to what you're talking about in that sense. You might have also noticed a little orange box in the corner of the slide. Throughout the presentation, I've put these orange boxes in each slide because there are multiple tools that I'll be talking about today, including nerds and some others. So I want to make sure that you're sort of following along, and the links are there, so you're more than welcome to sort of go and look at them later on in the presentation as well. Cool. Let's flip the coin. Which district do you think is in the top 1% of all US districts in terms of per pupil funding? Same list. San Jose, okay. Chelsea, Massachusetts, okay. Any others? Okay, White Plains. If you said White Plains, you would be right. They spend about $28,632 per kid, and another one is Camden City, New Jersey, $27,900. San Jose is up there also, and so is Chelsea, Massachusetts. Something that is extremely surprising about this data is the range is very, very, very wide. And I stress the word very so much because I've seen examples of schools that are spending $2,000 per kid, and truly they're spending only $2,000 per kid, and there are other schools that are spending close to $70,000 to $80,000 per kid, and that is also true. I always love to give an example of Alaska, where there's an island school that I got to learn about, where they're actually taking their kids on a plane to go to another island to attend school. That costs a lot of money, people. So the range is so wide, and that really sets the stage for what NERDS does. It's a database, and I'll come right back to you in a second, that has per pupil spending data for all 50 states plus DC, and I'll talk about where that data came from in just a second. Yes?
Just wondering, is per pupil the same as per student?
Yes, it's just, they're all synonymous. Yep, absolutely.
And is this per year?
It changes per year, but this data, and I'm glad you brought up that point, this data is a couple years old, 2018, 2019, but NERDS now has more recent data that you should be able to access for any of the schools or districts or states that you're looking for.
Do you want me to take any side? Okay.
So these are raw data. They don't take into account anything like that, but that's a great question as well. These come from Every Student Succeeds Act, and I can talk about that in my next slide as well, but these raw values don't take into account cost of living. Cool. So like I mentioned earlier, we'll try to travel through this presentation in the form of some questions. We'll develop on those questions, and then to answer those questions, I'll tell you what tools you can use from our website that will help you answer some of those questions. How much do schools spend by me per student? Great question. You want to understand how much they're spending, how much do schools in your district or state spend per student? Do some schools spend more than others? Does that seem fair? We've had so many conversations around equity and how much money goes into one school versus the other, especially if they're peers in terms of demographics, the way they look, and where they're placed. You want to understand and compare them. So we'll do a little bit of that exercise as well. And the last question would be, are certain schools underperforming and why? This is one of my favorites. This is where I really get to dive in and compare money with outcomes, which is one of our favorite things to do at Edunomics Lab, because you want to understand in the business of education where you're teaching your kids, you want to understand what's the return on investment. How are their outcomes? How are they performing? Okay, so this is one of my favorite images that we've used for a long time. NERDS will help us understand and answer the first question, how much do schools by me spend per student? So to go back in history, in 2015, not that long ago, a law was passed that was called Every Student Succeeds Act. It was under the Obama administration. It's sort of an add-on to No Child Left Behind in Elementary and Secondary Education Acts of the past. This law requires every state, every year, publish a report card with per pupil level spending, both from federal and local sources, along with accountability data, which basically is performance data. The first year of reporting was 2018-2019. 50 states, including DC, complied, and I say that because South Dakota skipped that year of data. They did a report in 2019-2020, not to single them out, but just giving you a heads up. And ever since, we've seen a lot of states meet the deadline and publish this data on their website. So that's where Edunomics Lab came in, and we came up with this idea of building a database because we wanted researchers and other stakeholders to have an immediate access instead of having to go to 50 different states' websites, and it's, trust me, it's very, very difficult. We've had a really hard time trying to get data sometimes. So we put this database together that helps users such as yourself to go and access data on a school level, at the district level, at the state level, and really understand how much money is being spent per student. So that's a very key variable that's part of the law, and that's why we were able to utilize this in our database. As of right now, NERDS has data from 2018-2019 and 2019-2020. In the next 2 months, we will also be uploading 2021. We're just waiting to sort of clean up the last few bits as we speak. So what can you learn in NERDS? This interface is actually super brand new. It's only 2 weeks old, and you guys are the first group that we're actually showing this screenshot to. It's been a very long time coming project of mine, and I'm very, very excited to sort of unveil to a group of people and users who will actually get access to it. So there's 3 modes that are accessible on this website and interface. You can go and find your school, see how spending works for that particular school. For that, you would need to know the state and the district for that specific school. You can download it as a PDF, share it with your readers, your parents, other people that you're interacting with. One of my favorites is All Schools in a District. This is really useful for researchers and journalists writing specific stories about districts and trying to compare one school to the other. This school level comparison is very, very impactful, trying to understand and compare peer schools that I mentioned earlier. And we'll do a little bit more of that later in the presentation. And the last one is a custom view. So if you were interested in sort of understanding are there peer schools in terms of percent economically disadvantaged students that look similar to each other? You can set those boundaries, filter for specific enrollment sizes for schools, and compare those peers. So you're basically custom building a table for your needs and analysis. So that's another really cool tool. Or if you just want an entire state's file, you can click on one of these buttons or the quick download up there. That does a very similar job and just gives you access to the entire state's data file that you can use. One of the advantages of using the whole data file, the interface only gives you core variables, which just means total, how much money comes from federal sources and state local sources. But if you download the file, you will see a huge swath of data. Like New York has close to 150 columns where they give you details on how much they spend on transportation per kid, food per kid, or mental health services per kid, special education per kid. So it's very helpful data. It's absolutely one of my favorites to use. So Nerds is a one-stop shop for people looking to do some analysis on how much money is spent per kid in different schools, and you'll get more data as and when we upload it. Cool. All right, so that was the first question. Do some schools spend more than others? Does that seem fair? This is one of my favorite questions to look at just because I'm always constantly bickering because I'm one of four with my parents. I'm like, how is it fair that they get more money than I do? How come they got more allowance and why not? Not that it's a very similar comparison, but just an analogy. So let's look at how we can answer this question. Before we start freaking out and why this looks like this is an example of a visualization that we help build, start up a conversation with the district leader, and this sort of spiraled into a much bigger project called SSOS, which stands for School Spending and Outcomes Snapshot. I think I got that right. It's a project we worked with the Federal Department of Education to build for district leaders and state leaders to make decisions based on the amount of per pupil funding their schools are getting. So let me explain what you're looking at here. It is actual spending data per student, all of these bars, for each school for a particular school year, including all public fund sources. So there's two kinds. You'll see that the dark line is spending from state and local sources, and the lighter shade up here is spending from federal sources. And it's very important, and I'll tell you that in a second why. The color shading of the different bars reflects students whose families are economically disadvantaged. The deeper the shade of red, the higher the percentage of disadvantaged students. We've done over 4 years of message testing on the color scheme alone because sometimes people will take a specific color to mean something versus the other. But every time we brought this color scheme in front of people, people really understood and imbibed the information a lot easier and better than any other color schemes that we tried out. More about that study is available on our website and more details about what color schemes and participant groups that we worked with. And I already mentioned about the darker and lighter portions there. So I've highlighted two schools here for us to take as an example. This school has a higher percentage of economically disadvantaged students, and they're getting about $9,925 per pupil. Their counterpart, on the other hand, a slightly wealthier, for lack of a better term, school, is spending $13,393 per pupil. So that's almost a $3,000 per pupil difference between those schools. Now, these are all elementary schools in the exact same districts. And a common misnomer is that we fund our schools based on zip codes. Unfortunately, that's not true. We do not fund our schools based on zip code. Especially, imagine, I'll take my city of Seattle as an example, several zip codes are all part of one public school district that makes the decisions for the funding and the resources that go to the schools within Seattle Public School District. So it's not based on zip code. Zip code may play some role in the local funding portion of it, but I will demystify that myth in a second coming up. Okay, so knowing that, here's another question. Which is not a reason that per pupil spending could be higher in one school than another in the very same district? And I'll give you a minute to look at this because these are kind of heavy examples. Any idea? One has senior teachers who receive higher salaries. Okay. Anybody else? Just venture a guess. F. One is in a neighborhood with higher property values. So we just touched upon that in the zip code sense of things. And if you said F, you would be right. One is in a neighborhood with higher property values. That does not determine or is not a reason that per pupil spending could be higher in one school than another in the same district. Because like I said, a zip code does not determine per pupil spending. The district's decisions do. Options A through E are all district decisions. They decide what resources and allocations go from one school to the other based on the decisions that they make and the amount of money they're allocated. So money comes to districts from something called a state funding formula. The state gives that money to the districts based on whatever their formula is. The formulas are all different. 50 states have 50 different formulas. I cannot stress that enough because it really determines how one state would differ from the other. Yes?
Every district have a different formula?
The district, and I will explain how they allocate from district specifically how the district allocates it to school, but yes and no. I don't think there's a straightforward answer to that, and I'll explain why. Any other? Yes?
In some cases, does that formula include property values?
None that come to top of mind, but I can get back to you on that if that impacts any of the funding formulas. So like I mentioned, districts receive all their money from the state funding formula, and then they make decisions like who gets Title I funds. So an analogy that my director, Marguerite Roselle, loves to give is there is no ATM sitting in the back of a school property. No one can just walk up and grab money. If one school gets the money, the other one doesn't get that pot of money. So it comes at the expense of one over the other. And the district makes those decisions for the schools. So it's very, very important to understand that. So this is where I want to sort of integrate a little bit of School Finance 101. How are our schools funded? A little pie chart, because who doesn't love a pie? So like I mentioned earlier, local sources that include taxes. It could be property taxes, sales taxes, whatever. It's a good mix of a bunch of taxes depending on where you live. And not everybody's completely heavily reliant on local taxes. That's where the zip code thing could probably play a role. That's where state comes in. The state funds often distributed to offset local funds from property wealth. So lower wealth districts tend to be more reliant on state funds versus the local funds. And local and state actually makes up the huge chunk of pie as opposed to what the myth is right now that the federal money really is a bigger portion. In reality, on average, the federal money in pre-pandemic times, let's talk pre-pandemic times, because this average comes from in a normal school year, federal share of the pie is anywhere between 8 to 10% on average. Again, this is a very average district. It does not speak to all districts by any means. It's just, its shares depend on the district and state specifically and their funding formula. Speaking of the federal swath of money, this massive influx of money that just came in because of the pandemic, on top of the national average for school spending is between $12,000 to $14,000 approximately. And to that $12,000 to $14,000 average, we added close to $3,000 to $4,000 per kid during the pandemic. So this is the COVID relief money that came in the last few years. They're called the ESSER funds. ESSER 1, 2, and 3, they came in 3 tranches. ESSER 1 expired in September of 2022. ESSER 2 expires this September, and ESSER 3 will expire the following September of 2024. So this is another story that people really want to keep track of, and I'll show you a tool later on that will help you sort of write stories that are relevant to that. So it's this largest one-time influx of money that our school districts have ever seen. And the problem is they don't know how to use this money efficiently so that once the expiration date comes, they're not hit with the fiscal cliff the following year because they lost all the money and they didn't spend it appropriately or efficiently, and now they have to keep up with the cost that they already incurred. So there's more story ideas in that specific realm of things if of interest. So keep in your understanding that the federal money is not really that big of a chunk of money as people might think. State and local really is where your meat is, and that's a story to be written about. Did that work? Okay. I briefly talked about the state funding formula. The state funding formula decides how the money gets to the districts. We've done some extensive research and built this thing called a decision tree. I will not go deep diving into this resource because it could be its whole other presentation, but I wanted to put this resource out there for people to go and check out if of interest. If you ever want to do a storyline on state funding formulas, this decision tree takes into account a lot of external resources, interviews with stakeholders, especially state education leaders, and following their stories. And we put this bundle together that really helps sort of put it into the context. So it's on our website, and you're more than welcome to take that and write a story about it. And you're also welcome to reach out to us if you ever have questions about this decision tree. It's been a labor of love, as we like to say, for a lot of people at a genomics lab. To come back to your question, so how are the districts now allocating that money? So there's a few different ways the money gets to schools, and we like to call them in 3 different models. It just really helps sort of boil it down in the simplest terms. The first model is called a centralized model. So think of the district getting this entire pot of money. Instead of sending it to the schools and having them decide, the district buys all of their resources. They buy full-time staff, they buy their resources, packages, what education-related, Khan Academy or whatever, and then distributes it to their schools based on whatever decisions they've made. So one school's victory is another school's loss, in lack of a better term ways, in that particular model. It's called the centralized model. The second that we at Genomics absolutely love is the decentralized model, which is a student-based weighted student formula or funding formula, where the district gets the money, and then based on the student type, demographics, needs of the school, what sort of enrollment they have, or demographic-related enrollment they have, they give the money to the school. And an amount of money is earmarked to a school, and then the school decides what sort of resources they need to buy to meet the needs of their students, which is what we call the weighted student formula, where you're weighting the needs of your students to use those dollars and put them to good use.
With that model, does that only work for? Sorry. With that model, I imagine you would have to have more local funds to make that model work, as far as like the flexibility and allowing the schools to choose how to spend the money.
And it would be totally district dependent, but I can see that, yes. Some districts that actually come to mind who follow this model are some of the districts that you guys live in: Milwaukee, Houston, DC, Boston. Some very, very large metropolitan districts follow this model. A lot of districts also do sort of a hybrid of the two that we've seen, but we like to mostly figure out how districts that are using the weighted student formula succeeding in their approach towards money allocation. So these are the 3 models that we like to talk about, and that really help sort of boil down to how's the money coming to our schools and where's the money going and what is being spent on. Okay, so I think we can come back to another question now. Are certain schools underperforming and why? And like I said earlier, this is one of my favorite things to talk about because this really gets into the core of, okay, so now we've made the investment, how are the students doing given this investment? Because then you'll be able to come and circle back and be like, okay, well, do we need more investment? Is that what we need? Or do we need to be more efficient with our money for better outcomes towards the end? So it's sort of like an intertwined question that really helps you build on and ask important queries of your district leaders and ask of them, hey, you're spending all of this money on your students, and I see the other district or the other school within the district is getting more money, but their students are not really performing for the amount of money spent on them. What do we do about it? How do we get all of our students on track to success and spend as efficiently as possible? So those are some crucial questions that we've seen some of the reporters also write about using NERDS data in the past. So that's something to think about. Okay, so I want you to think of a school that you personally know well. Maybe you attended a school here and or near your home, and how would you characterize the school? Anyone can give me an answer, and there's no way to fact check it unless we go back and look it up, but we will do that at the end. Okay, think about it, and we'll come back to it. Okay, another really cool chart. So this is a scatter plot. It is plotting on the x-axis our per pupil spending for all the schools for this particular state. We've only plotted the high poverty elementary schools for this particular district that you're looking at. The circle size refers to the enrollment size of the particular school. So the larger the circle, the higher the enrollment, the smaller the circle, smaller enrollment. The pluses are charter schools. And the 4 quadrants basically help map out for the spending for that particular school, what kind of outcomes are our students getting. So outcomes basically are state exam outcomes. So how are the students performing on state exams? And that really makes these scatter plots very customizable and unique to a state. Unfortunately, we don't have a standardized test. NAEP, of course, is one. But in form of testing for math or ELA in every state that is uniform across all 50 states. Maybe someday we will, but hopefully that day comes soon enough. And the colors, as similar to the array that we saw earlier, the darker the shade of the red, the higher percent economically disadvantaged students that we're referring to in that school. So let's deduce this scatter plot a little bit and try to understand what is it telling me. School A. School A is successful with its students, but with more public dollars. So they are spending, well, between 12 to 13 from what I can gather, $1,000. They're a much smaller school compared to their peers. So again, these are all their peers. And they are actually getting good outcomes, relatively better outcomes. They are successful, but they're spending a lot more to be successful. Yes?
By outcomes, are you talking about high testing scores? Are you talking about high attendance? Like, what's the outcome?
We're talking about person proficient or advanced in ELA and math exam or state exams that they've taken in grade, depending on the state, the grades that they've taken. And another example that I'll show later will be specific to grade 4 and grade 8 proficiency. But great question, yeah. School B. School B is also receiving more dollars. They're on the same paradigm right there. Receiving more dollars than peers, but they're really unable to leverage them to get better outcomes for their students. Peers, getting just as much money, or maybe even more, slightly larger school, but not as good, relatively good as outcomes. School C is what we love to call our ROI superstar, return on investment superstars. They're better able to leverage their dollars, and with the limited money that they have, they're able to do more for their students in terms of outcomes. So we want to see all of our schools sort of hover over in this sort of quadrant. And last but not the least, School D receives fewer dollars than peers. It's also a fairly large school. If you see, it's one of the largest circles up there after C. Fewer dollars than peers and has lower outcomes. So this is a really unique tool that helps. Again, this is not the end-all be-all of data. This without context means nothing. This is just finger pointing. If you just bring it in front of your leaders and say, hey, we think that you're doing this wrong, that would be a little unfortunate. Unfortunate is the wrong term, but it wouldn't be okay to ask your district leader to just try to justify without knowing context, because that school B could have very well had some sort of an issue happen at school, possibly a shooting, or some sort of a reason why they were underperforming that led to that specific data point. So again, adding context to your story with this data will really elevate and bring a little bit more of a buy-in from your readers to understand, oh, this makes sense in the light of that. So sort of X because Y, and it'll really, really elevate your stories from that standpoint. Let's look at one particular district in light of the state, and you should be able to do this on our tool as well. You can highlight a specific district and compare them to the entirety of the state, because you'll be able to see your district amongst its peers. So in this example, the peers are spending much less, probably also getting better outcomes for their high poverty schools. And this is a conversation to be had with a district leader where you can present it in front of them and try to understand, okay, well, looking at a state level, what are you doing to better leverage the dollars and especially leverage those resources that you can provide to these schools compared to their other counterparts. So we're only looking at high poverty schools. There are non-high poverty schools here, or wealthier schools for lack of a term, in that district who are probably doing better than those particular schools in this example. So this particular tool, I want to clarify, it was built for a specific audience because we did it in partnership with the Federal Department of Education. So the ability to filter or adjust may not be as advanced as we would like it to be. So what we did, we went ahead and built our own tool because we love to do that. We just keep building tools. We did a spending versus outcomes in Tableau. I took up an example that I actually just built yesterday, and I rushed to put this in the presentation. But this is from Ohio. Nothing particularly wrong about Ohio. I'm not trying to pick on them, but was the example that I came up with. We have 4 different ways of measuring their success or particular success, like I mentioned earlier. We have 4th grade proficiency, 8th grade proficiency, and their 4-year graduation rate, because we sort of wanted to see how our students, if you were to take a midpoint in elementary school, middle school, and high school, what sort of performance are we seeing? This particular visualization is super customizable because you can filter this one for grades. You can filter this one for specific demographics if you want to see how are Black students doing versus our Hispanic or Latino students doing versus other students in this school. So it's very customizable. Yes.
Yeah. So if we look this up on the site,
Yeah.
are those all those circles are specific schools? And like,
Yes.
can you tell? Does it tell you what school is which?
Yeah, so you would have to hover over, it's dynamic, I think that's the word, dynamic, where you will hover over a circle and you should be able to tell which school it is, and it'll give you a whole list of information of school name, district name, their enrollment, percent, economically disadvantaged, and what their proficiency in whatever specific. So here we're measuring their performance index score. So Ohio does this school level metric where they grade their schools. I don't want to be misquoted here, but I believe it's between 1 and 120 points. I think it's what it's called, and that's sort of the band in which they're grading the school. So it's like an overall metric of performance for that particular school. But when you go over to 4th and 8th grade, you'll see their performance in English language arts. You'll see their performance in math. We haven't included science and social sciences yet, just because of the lack of data for most states. So we wanted to go with something that's available for all states, because ELA and math are required by law for most states, and federal accountability requires that they produce those results. So we went with this specific metric because it's available by law, not because it's the only end-all be-all measure, as I keep saying, that this is just the conversation starter. You really can go above and beyond from here and ask a bit more questions on how relevant this is in the context of where you're living and how that school is performing and in the areas that they are in. So Scatterplot's really, really cool tool and very customizable.
You kind of just explain again what the dots mean and like the results mean, what it tells you.
No, for sure. So for the amount of investment that we're making on a per pupil basis for a particular school, so let's just take this as an example, how are they performing on a scale of 1 to 120, which is the performance index score. Similarly, if you were to go to 4th grade, you will see how are they doing in English? How many students are percent proficient or above in ELA for 4th grade, given the amount of money that we're spending on them. So it's basically an understanding of return on investment is what we're trying to get at here.
Do you ever hear from decision makers who will say, look at a graph like this and say, well, maybe a school or parents saying, hey, we want more money, we want more investment.
Oh my God, every single day.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, the results here, money
Absolutely.
is not the issue.
Absolutely.
We don't want to give you more money.
Absolutely, and that's why I keep saying the context matters a lot. Like, is it a problem of them not getting enough money, or is it a problem of them not putting their money towards the right things? They're two very different things. So this is, again, a conversation starter, but absolutely, what a great question that we do hear from stakeholders who are asking, oh, well, if we got more money, we would have done better. But I'm like, in some circumstances, you are getting a lot more money compared to your peers. So this is a great way of sort of pointing that out. Again, it's not name calling or telling them what's wrong, but really trying to get to the bottom of things and trying to understand, okay, how do we come up with the solution together? It's one of those conversations to be had. We have a question here.
Maria just made me think of something, but I'm not quite sure how to ask it. So just to play devil's advocate here, you gave an example of districts that are your return of investment superstars.
Sure.
And we see that they receive less, but they have good outcomes.
Right.
In that line of thinking, do we start thinking about like, maybe getting money isn't the issue, but more so how the schools and the districts themselves are using it? Like, have people use that as an example to say, you don't need more money, y'all just need to do a better job of using it?
That's a great question, by the way. I wouldn't necessarily come from the point of disregarding that you don't need more money, but also what is it that we can learn from this particular school? What is it that they're doing compared to as opposed to their peers that is working for them? Again, the demographics may not be similar for those schools. They may not be peer in that truest sense of the word, and that will heavily impact what their needs are. But again, like I said, it's a conversation starter. You don't want to point fingers saying that, oh, just because you don't have enough money, you're not doing as much for that. Right. So it's one of those conversations to be had where you bring in the context and get to understand how to leverage and what to leverage. So what is it that they're doing that maybe we can implement to be successful ourselves as well? But great question.
I know there's a lot of different factors that would lead to this like return of on investment superstars, but do you have any examples of particular districts that are really doing well with leveraging their dollars?
Ooh, you put me on the spot. I don't, but I can look that up and definitely get back to you because I'm sure we have some, and we've used some examples in the past in some of our trainings, but great question. I'll come back to you on that. Yeah.
But I recall covering this issue during the welfare reform debate, and a lot of times legislators would say, well, that school in the south side of Chicago is spending $10,000 per student and it's got the worst scores in the world and it's awful, blah, blah, blah. What are the characteristics other than maybe outright graft or whatever, but how can that amount of money go into a school and it not be utilized? Where's it going, I guess is what I'm asking. Are there any thoughts about, is it mostly being misspent and stolen, or?
It would be unfair for me to say it's being misspent because I am not aware of the context of a particular district and how they're spending it. But from the general trends we're seeing as researchers, we want to help understand, okay, what is it that we think some successful, again, these outcomes are what the state's telling us, right? Or what the school is telling us. We don't know what's really going on behind. We're not really asking every child to go ahead and read a book for us. So again, it's very contextual and it's very hard for me to answer your question, but it's one of those justified ones too, because that's where we want people to go in and really investigate, because people on the ground know so much better than us sitting nationally and trying to research and tell them what to do, which is a little unfair without knowing context, and only they know their situation better. But great questions to be asked. So far, I've tried to help you answer, do some schools spend more than others? Does that seem fair? We used the scatter plots and arrays to sort of answer this tool. How much do schools by me spend per student? We used NERDs, or we can use NERDs to find an answer to that and get more updated data as and when we upload them. Are certain schools underperforming? Why? We use the scatter plots, so both SSOS and the scatter plots on our website will help answer that question, or at least get the conversation started. Like I said, it's very contextual. But I sort of want to add one more question to it because I'm a little hungry and I like having more tools on my hand and telling people what we're doing. So how is ESSER spending going? It's so timely and it's in the moment, and I want you to jump at it before it ends because it does expire in September 24. So we really want to see more stories being written about, and we continue to do more research every single day on how people are spending their money as well, because it's really fascinating, and we love to tell stories about that ourselves as well. So how do we figure out how ESSER money is being spent, or how is ESSER spending going? So one of the most recent, and mind you, award-winning tools, we actually won the most actionable research, my coworker and I, at the PI Awards this past year for this particular tool that we built, is called the Estimated Learning Loss Calculator. So during the pandemic, there was a lot of research that came out from the likes of NWEA, NBER, the Harvard Education Policy Center. I'm probably getting that name wrong, but I think you get the point. We used a lot of their research to sort of come up with an estimator because we really wanted to boil it down to the simplest words possible to explain to a parent or a teacher or district leader, okay, this is where you lost time and this is how much we think your students need to make up for from the pandemic. And again, these are all estimates. And ever since we built this calculator, there has been a lot more research that has come out. Harvard especially has come out with something which is very precise, and they've used a lot of very, very good data that was collected, especially through NAEP, that was recently published, to do their study. So you're more than welcome to check out all of those resources. This is just an estimator to help get the ball rolling. Initially, when it came out, it really was a helpful tool for people to start conversations with their leaders. So we're basically telling you, on average, based on how long the school was closed or was hybrid or had in-person instruction, based on their results from prior years, how much time of learning loss did a particular district experience in terms of weeks? We only did this for math and reading because that is the best level of data that's out there available for at least all 50 states plus DC. So I just use an example of Warwick from North Dakota here to say that they lost 13 weeks on average. Now again, this will differ from student to student, district to district for everybody. On average, how much did they lose? So 13 weeks in math, 14 weeks in reading. How do we remedy for this? So we use tutoring as an example because there's a lot of research that's out there that proves that tutoring, whether it be 4-to-1, 1-to-1, or whatever the ratio may be, dependent on district's ability to pursue it, has proven to be a successful remedy towards learning loss and helping students really engage and grasp the material much better. So we averaged using some numbers. I actually don't remember the exact amount on per pupil basis that we used as the underlying factor, but came up with some amount saying, oh, okay, this is how much maybe on average, or at the very minimum being the crux word here, do you have to spend to get tutoring in math or tutoring in reading to make up for that time lost up on the top. And lastly, ARP ESSER. So ARP ESSER is the third wave of ESSER that was passed, and it required that at the very least, 20% of the money should be earmarked to fund towards learning loss, to make up for learning loss. And that could mean a whole lot of things for most districts, but at least you have to spend 20% towards it. So what we did was we reminded our districts, hey, you have that money sitting there in your bank. Go put it towards helping your children make up for the time lost, make up for the learning loss caused due to the pandemic. So what are some questions that our reporters and people have asked once they looked at this calculator to their district? What data does the district have? So this is an estimator, right? We're just using a national research that was published and making estimates. What data does district specifically have to sort of claim that, hey, I think we know how much time our students have lost? It does not have to be in weeks. It has to be some sort of data. So asking our district leaders, okay, do you have any sort of data that proves that, yes, the students have lost some time in learning and would need to make up for it? Based on the data, now that they know how much time is lost, have they changed course? So once the money came in, if you guys remember, they had to send in planned spending plans. And that planned spending would help understand, okay, how are they really approaching this crisis and helping our students make up for the time lost? So based on this data, did the districts actually change course? Did they take a new trajectory saying, oh, I think this makes sense, so let's put it towards, I don't know, getting a Khan Academy subscription to all of our students to make up for math, or give our high school students extra money to go and teach their younger students how to do math, basic algebra or arithmetic. So very creative solutions that I could list tons and tons of them, but that's not the purpose of this presentation. But have districts taken that course or changed their course to meet the needs of the hour? Is this money more than the 20% set aside? So the 20% that I alluded to earlier, have they only spent 20% or actually gone above and beyond, spend more than 20% to really make up for that loss? Because sometimes the 20% might not even be enough out of that total allocation to make up for what we estimated to be the tutoring costs. And does this district have funds it can use to support investments that exceeded its available ESSER 3 funds? Now, this is a very, very important question because, as I very briefly mentioned earlier, the districts have to be very mindful of the fact that these come at an expiration date. There is a looming fiscal cliff, like we like to call it, because if you did not choose or make decisions that were sustainable with the money you actually have outside of the pandemic money, you're going to lose all of these things. If you gave your teachers massive bonuses and things like that are not sustainable with your actual budget outside of the pandemic money, you're going to have to lay people off, or you're going to have to make adjustments and choices, and then that's when one school will get more than the other because their needs are different or whatever. So one school's money is the other school's loss. Things like that. These are some like overarching questions that go with that specific prompt right there. So think of it in that term. Another tool that we recently built, my coworker Katie and I just actually pushed this map out 3 days ago. We had a really different looking map on our website with only ESSER 3 expenditures. Now we have ESSER 1, 2, and 3 expenditures for all 50 states. That color is looking faded out, but it's just a different shade of purple. It's not gray. We have the data for those states. This is actually examining, like I mentioned earlier, they had to put planned spending out before they were actually spending the money, but now we need to know how are you actually spending the money? Are you following through on your plans? This tool will actually tell you that. What are they spending their money on? I was having a good conversation with Megan last night, and the two of you really helped me understand that, yeah, there's not a lot of actual data that tells us anything critical, and that's true. It's a little unfortunate because the level of detail is missing in a lot of these states and a lot of districts that are pushing out the data. So this is a conversation to be had with the state. How do we hold you accountable? How do we hold our districts accountable with all this money that was given to them in the midst of a pandemic, and to meet the needs of the hour for our students and the future citizens of the country? How do we hold you accountable? What are you spending it on? If you're saying you plan to spend the money on social emotional learning, are you really doing it? But not just that, take it a step further and say, okay, now that you've done it, how are you measuring it? How do I measure the success of your investment? That's a bigger question to be asked. So these are some thoughts that I really wanted to bring with me to you and give you some questions to ponder about, because these are stories that people have written about and are constantly thinking about. I did not mean to go back. There you go. So we tried to answer some of these questions, and we have the tools to answer those questions and take it a step further and take it to our leaders and ask more mindful questions and a little bit more probing. But here are some actual story ideas. Which schools in our district spend the most or least per student? Very overarching, very simple, very easy to understand if you can get access to NARDS, and go from there specific to your needs. Do students of color and or from low-income families get a fair share? It's such a great and apt question to be asked in terms of the times that we live in, where marginalized communities are being overlooked in terms of spending and also the resources being provided, especially peer schools within the very same district with marginalized communities are not getting the access from at least what we see on the forefront. This is a question to be asked to districts. What are you doing about it? Are you taking active steps to sort of mend that problem? The third one is really, really cool and something that we're on the lookout for and researching ourselves. Do small schools get more, and should they? And let's talk about this for a second. I would keep an eye out for this one just because we're reaching, and this term that I've used earlier, a point of fiscal cliff. You gave them all this money, you gave all the smaller schools a lot of money, but do you have the money to keep them sustained at the level that you're funding them now? Probably not. So let's take an example. A district that buys resources, a centralized model district, buys the resources, decides to give 2 vice principals to each school in their district. Imagine the role of those 2 vice principals in a school of 50 kids or 100 kids versus the 2 vice principals in a school of 6,000 kids. What's the value add for one versus the other, and what's the need? So that small school is going to struggle once the money runs out because we don't have the money to keep funding them the same way that we did earlier. So we've set up a standard, and now we're going to reach a fiscal cliff. So that's a story that we're really looking forward to for people to track and write about and try to like interview people about it. Are you thinking about this?
What kind of spending is considered fiscal cliff and other spending that makes sense? So like hiring a tutoring, more tutors, temporary, that wouldn't be considered a fiscal cliff.
Right. So
but then
something that's more long-term and permanent, so something that will last you forever, but you don't have the funds to cover for it for the longest term that you've planned it for.
Do you have a sense of, at least anecdotally I hear from, and I report on the northern Illinois region, and folks are like, oh, like you said, they're like a deadline. They're like, oh, well, we'll remodel the gym instead of like tutoring, and you think there's that idea too of like just kind of not wanting to kind of do something temporary, that because of that idea of a fiscal cliff, even though it's like it's okay that it's temporary, because like you said, it's like an injection to kind of move things,
right?
And so then it's like, no, well, we'll just do buildings and instead of people.
Right, and we are seeing a lot of facility investment, for lack of a better term. We're seeing a lot of investments in facilities and things that I guess have a long-term gain in mind for our districts. But we're trying to have those conversations with district leaders and state leaders. I don't, off the top of my head, know of any reactions personally. I can connect you with Marguerite, my director, who works directly with the people who might be able to give you a better quote or an answer to that. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of investments on facilities, and actually we're at this very moment researching for a paper that we're going to write about facilities and how money is being spent specifically on that, or something with a longer term goal in mind. But I can come back to you on that question with my director. Yes, we have two people.
If I could jump in real quick. Thanks for the great presentation. I had a question about the spending per student, because in Milwaukee, at least, there's a lot of private philanthropy that goes to the charter schools. Is what you're looking at just the public dollars, and do you know of anyone that's tried to look at how the private spending breaks down?
That's a great question that someone's asked us before as well. We personally have not looked at private funding. We only look at public sources, but there are certain researchers out there who've looked at specifically private funding. Off the top of my head, one I can think of is from Connecticut, and I can get back to you with that research via an email. But yeah, there's some research out there that's been done in that and would be very successful.
I just wanted to ask if within the NERDS database, if there's a way to look at English language learners, or
Unfortunately, not right now, but it is a future plan where we're trying to get in a little bit more data points that are customizable. So something like that would be very nice to have. Unfortunately, states don't record a lot of data. Spending would be really hard to isolate to a specific demographic. Very, very few states. I could literally count on my hands how many states actually have data on specific demographics like special education needs and things like that, how much they're spending, because it's really hard to isolate from an accounting standpoint. But that's like a simple answer for now. Hopefully in the future we'll have better data for that through other means.
Some of the data you mentioned a lot of it's from 2018, 2019. I know you're updating.
Right.
What concerns do you have for journalists who are using this before the pandemic data comes out? What should we be aware of, or what do you think our editors might be wary of when we're using pre-pandemic data?
That's a great question, and I would defer to sort of maybe communicating with researchers like us who will give you a better estimate of a projection of what a number could look like for current times, instead of trying to say ballpark numbers, because I totally relate to you where you don't want to give someone an old number and say, oh, this is what we think is going to happen. And it's more relatable if you get a little bit more current numbers. So projecting numbers would be a good idea in absence of anything more current. But we're with the ESSA sort of now being 3 years in or 4 years in of reporting, states have really picked up pace. Like I'm already seeing data from 21, 22, the school that year just passed, audited, completed. Illinois is a good example. Great relationship with Illinois, and we already have their data, and we're trying to upload it to our database as soon as possible. So you will see a lot more current data coming much faster than it would have in the past. So I'm really excited about that, but great question. I just want to end with reminders of when you write your story and think of what my story is, always consider using per pupil costs. It really gets that buy-in, and research has proven it. Do not overvalue federal investment. This one-time investment is not going to last. On an average, we only see about 8 to 10% from the entire pie is federal investment. School boards and districts decide how the money is spent. Very, very important. School Finance 101. Connect spending and performance. Think of how the investment is really impacting the students, because we're trying to get the most for our students, right? We're really trying to put in this money so our students will excel and be better readers, better mathematicians, and whatever success looks like for them in the future. So think about connecting those two dots and putting them together. Never doubt that school effects matter. So context matters, what's happening at the school really matters, and it'll take you a really long way and put your stories out there. Cool. I just wanted to give a quick note on if you want to take it a step further and deep dive into education finance, and I'm really proud to have an alum in the room here. Megan's taken this certificate before. We do a certificate. Journalists, most often than not, end up getting a scholarship. So if you apply right in time, we'd love to work with you. Please reach out to me on my email if you have questions. We have 2 cohorts coming up this spring. We have one in New York City. It's a 2-day residency followed by 7 follow-up virtual sessions, but the 2-day residency is in person. First one's in New York City and the second one's in Los Angeles in April. So if you have any questions about that or in general about this presentation or our data and would love to connect with you. If you have stories you want to talk about, or if you want to run through data with me, oh my God, nothing makes me more excited than running data with people over Zoom. So please reach out, and I'm very happy to communicate about whatever your needs are.
I promised you a dynamic presentation and from someone who is really passionate about this issue, and we delivered. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Ash Dhammani, for joining our journalism training. So let's give him a well-deserved round of applause.